It was a command. The radio crackled in every home, in every village, in every town of Burkina Faso, and the words thundered like a sermon from the heavens. Not 1,000, not 1 million, but 100 million. 100 million what? Pineapples. Yes, pineapples. In a land where millet often fails, where goats search for grass and find only dust, the captain of the nation, Ibrahim Traoré, dared to speak the impossible. He told his people to rise up, to plant a wall of sweetness where once there had only been bitterness. Brothers and sisters, let that sink in. Pineapples in the Sahel. To many it sounded absurd, laughable, even dangerous. Yet that is how faith always begins, with a vision too bold for the cautious, too daring for the timid, too sweet for the cynical. For decades, Burkina Faso had been branded a victim of drought, of famine, of desertification. The world spoke of its suffering with pity, but rarely with hope. Billions of dollars in aid flowed like rivers that never reached the roots. Foreign consultants came and went, promising salvation yet leaving only reports gathering dust. And in the face of all this, Ibrahim Traoré stood and declared, "We cannot fight the desert with pity. We must fight it with imagination." And so the seed of a revolution was planted. Not in secret chambers, not in air-conditioned offices, but in the fields, in the schools, in the villages, where ordinary people carried suckers of pineapple as if they were carrying the crown of sovereignty itself. A nation once bowed by drought straightened its back. Children sang songs of sweetness. Soldiers laid down rifles to carry shovels. Mothers and grandmothers tended nurseries that would one day outlast the desert winds. Now, beloved, I invite you into this story. It is not just the tale of a fruit. It is the tale of a people who chose to believe that life could spring from dust, that sweetness could bloom in sand, that sovereignty could grow where despair once ruled. If this message already stirs something inside you, I ask you, subscribe, stay with me, and let us walk together through the miracle of Ibrahim Traoré's vision. Let us set the stage, brothers and sisters. Burkina Faso, a land in the heart of West Africa, a land of resilience, a land of dignity, a land where the Sahel stretches wide and the Sahara presses southward like a hungry beast devouring soil, devouring villages, devouring hope. Year after year the sand advanced. Fields withered, cattle starved, and families whispered the same weary question. How much longer can we survive? International agencies came with their blueprints and their promises. They spoke of megadams and genetically modified seeds, of great reforestation projects funded with billions of dollars. But on the ground, the story was the same. The sand did not stop. The desert laughed at their plans. And the people of Burkina Faso remained trapped in a narrative of scarcity, always positioned as beggars, never as builders. It was into this despair that Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose with a word not of pity, but of audacity. At dawn, through the hum of radios, he called for a wall of sweetness. Not a wall of stone, not a wall of concrete, a wall of pineapples. Not 1,000, not 1 million, but 100 million plants stretching along the frontier. A living barrier between the devouring sands and the fragile grasslands of the Sahel. To many it sounded like madness. Pineapples? In the Sahel? This spiky fruit was known only in markets, imported from Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire, expensive and exotic. Few farmers had ever touched its leaves, let alone planted it. And yet Ibrahim Traoré saw not just a fruit, but a strategy written into the very design of creation. Why pineapples? Because they are tough. Their leaves guard moisture. Their roots anchor the soil. Their very form resists the wind. Where other crops wither, pineapples endure. And more than that, pineapples feed the body with vitamins, feed the market with profit, and feed the spirit with symbolism. In many cultures, the pineapple is a sign of hospitality, of abundance, of resilience. In the Sahel, it would become a crown rising from the dust, declaring, "We shall not be buried by sand." This plan had 3 layers. First, the ecological wall, a line of spiky green soldiers planted to hold back erosion, to preserve soil, to slow the march of the desert. Second, the nutritional wall. Fresh fruit, rich in life-giving vitamins, placed on the tables of villages where malnutrition had long been the silent killer. Third, the economic wall. Juice factories, dried fruit industries, export potential that could rival cotton and gold. Traoré was not just planting crops, he was planting sovereignty. And so the nation mobilized. Farmers dedicated plots of land. Schools turned planting into lessons of pride. Women's cooperatives received grants to build nurseries and sell young plants. Youth brigades marched with shovels digging trenches in the frontier sands. Even the army, once known for weapons, now became a planting force. Helicopters carrying crates of pineapple suckers instead of ammunition. The logistics were staggering. Pineapple shoots were brought in from Ghana and multiplied in nurseries across the land. Agricultural institutes trained farmers in mulching, water retention, and spacing. State radio broadcasted tutorials while drones filmed long rows of plants stretching like green rivers across the desert. And online slogans spread, "From sand to sweetness." Pineapples of sovereignty. Sisters and brothers, something began to shift. Where once the people heard empty speeches from foreign donors, now they heard a command from their own leader. Where once planting meant survival, now it meant defiance. Where once the frontier was feared, now it became a stage of hope. A new ritual was born as families planted together, prayed together, and dreamed together of fields crowned with fruit. But do not be mistaken, this was not simply agriculture. This was theater. This was prophecy. This was imagination turned into action. Each pineapple planted was more than a seedling. It was a declaration, we will not surrender. The Western media scoffed. Development experts shook their heads. They called it pineapple populism, a fantasy doomed to fail. Yet ordinary Burkinabe, weary of empty promises, felt a spark inside. They said, if grapes grew here, if dragon fruit survived here, why not pineapples? The gamble had begun. The desert still loomed vast and merciless. The sand still howled with the wind. But now, across that barren edge, millions of tiny crowns began to break the surface, defiant, sharp, alive. And so, beloved, we reach a turning point. The nation had planted. The vision had taken root. But the desert does not surrender easily. The first tests were coming. The question was no longer, will the people obey? They had obeyed. The question was, would the desert allow it? The sand was waiting, the storms were gathering, and the true battle of the 100 million pineapple plan was about to begin. And then, beloved, the desert answered back. The first season had barely begun when the Sahel bared its teeth. Sandstorms swept across the frontier like armies of dust, burying tender shoots beneath suffocating dunes. Families who had planted with trembling hope awoke to find their fields blanketed in death. Goats and cattle, confused by the sudden green, broke through and devoured rows of young plants before fences could rise. When the rains ended, the merciless heat returned, cracking the ground, snapping irrigation lines, drying the seedlings before their roots had even tasted the soil. For many, it was confirmation of their deepest fears. The desert cannot be tamed, some whispered in the villages. International observers, already skeptical, began drafting their reports of inevitable failure. Western newspapers mocked the plan with scornful headlines. Pineapples in the Sahara? Burkina Faso's fantasy agriculture. But leadership, my brothers and sisters, is not proven in times of ease. Leadership is revealed in the furnace of trial. And Ibrahim Traoré did not shrink back. He stood firm, and with a voice steady as stone, he reframed the narrative. If 1 in 10 survives, that is 10 million crowns of sovereignty. 10 million fruits feeding our people. 10 million living testimonies that Burkina Faso is alive. He turned despair into theater, loss into mission. On the radio, the call went out. Uncover the crowns of sovereignty. And across the land, villagers, children included, dug through the sand with bare hands, rescuing buried plants as if they were rescuing the very soul of the nation. Soldiers, once trained to fight men, now built spiky barriers of cactus and thorn, guarding fields as though defending a fortress. Every setback became a scene of defiance. Every obstacle was transformed into proof of courage. Meanwhile, agricultural scientists worked quietly side by side with farmers. They taught mulching with dry grasses to hold precious moisture. They dug zai pits, traditional water harvesting holes, to capture rainfall around pineapple roots. In some regions, they intercropped pineapples with acacia trees, creating shade that cooled the soil and slowed evaporation. What looked like chaos to outsiders was, in truth, a living laboratory of innovation. Burkina Faso was not only planting fruit, it was rewriting the science of survival in the Sahel. Yes, the survival rate in the first year was low, hovering around 30%. Yes, millions of seedlings perished. But remember this, beloved, 30% of 100 million is still 30 million. And 30 million pineapples meant thousands of tons of fruit, thousands of hectares anchored, thousands of families with a reason to hope. Partial victory in the Sahel was greater than perfect failure from foreign consultants. The international stage took notice. Donors clung to their skepticism, but ordinary Africans saw something new. They saw a nation refusing to bow. They saw a people turning suffering into sovereignty. And slowly, whispers began to spread across the continent. If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? Delegations from Mali, Niger, Senegal came to walk the planting zones. Journalists from Europe and Asia arrived to film what they had once mocked. But the truest impact was at home. For the first time in living memory, farmers who once buried their hopes in dry earth now stood tall, speaking with pride of the crowns they had
stands
saved.
to lose hundreds of millions as diesel contracts evaporate.
2025.
Artists painted
The
murals of
victory at
pineapples
Futuri
rising like
was
shields
dramatic,
against the desert
but it was
winds.
not
And
isolated.
across villages, the phrase spread like a
Respect
hymn.
backed by real
The desert
action.
will fight, but we
And
will
what-
fight
Si c'est pas
harder.
déjà prêt,
Traoré
où les gens
himself
pourront
traveled to
suivre
the
les
harshest
instructions
zones,
d'évolution.
walking
Et ça
among
évolue très
wilted
bien et
plants,
depuis-
sweat
Within
mingling in the
72
sand,
hours of
his hands
Traoré's
in the dirt
declaration,
beside the people.
Washington struck
State
back.
cameras captured the image of a leader not in
L'AES, c'est
palaces,
une
but in
défense en
fields.
commun.
And those images
Quen.
mattered more than statistics. They told the people,
Thì
"You
đối
are
diện
not
tòa nhà
alone.
chính quyền này
Your leader plants with
and real
you.
dust pulled
Your
in from
nation
3
pleads with you.
locations,
And together you
reduced
will
visibility
endure.
to Tyre
Ah,
Sahel.
beloved, hear me now.
Ouagadougou,
The desert had
the
struck its
21st
hardest
of
blow.
August.
It had
2000.
buried seedlings. It had starved the land. It had
Tout est
mocked
normal
human
que
ambition.
nous on
Yet still
cultive
crowns of green
l'arachide.
pushed
Drawn
back through the
support
sand.
for the bill.
Fragile,
A
yes,
few governors
but
have
alive.
cautiously
And that
backed
is when the
the-
first glimmers
We're
of hope
witnessing the
appeared.
birth of a
In
global
scattered
shift,
plots, survivors not
one
only
where
endured,
leadership-
they
When they
thrived.
attempt to
Their leaves
manipulate
grew thick and
truth,
sharp.
when they wield
Their crowns
authority
stood
as a
tall.
weapon
And
rather
in
than a
time, small golden
Simmered
fruits began to
deeper.
emerge, poking
How long
defiantly
has the
through
devil
dust.
worn the robes of a
Children
priest?
carried them to markets.
And if this
Women dried them and packaged them as
Lorsque
desert
nous nous sommes
sweetness.
rendus qu'il y avait
Buyers
un
in the
problème
capital
de...
every
paid
week
double
holding
just to taste
villages
what
from
the world had
collapse,
declared
that
impossible.
blur was felt as a
Desert
wound
had
deeper
tested
than
them.
bullets.
The critics had
An
mocked
insult.
them. But
These were
Burkina
not
Faso
child
was still
abductors
standing.
or school burners.
Yet this was only the
Relied on
beginning.
coordinated
If a
supply
single
found
fruit could
themselves
stir a nation,
stranded.
what would happen when
Recruits who
millions
once rallied-
ripened?
This
Would
project
Burkina Faso's
continues.
gamble turn into a
Why?
feast? Or would
Because
the world
Burkina
rise
Faso
against
term
its wall
contracts
of
were inked
sweetness?
30,
By the
40,
third season,
even
beloved,
50
the tide had
years
begun
locking
to
in
turn.
cheap access at
The
colonial
storm still
prices.
came,
And then,
the heat still
within
pressed,
hours,
but something
the very
stronger
act
than the
that he
desert was
thought would
rising.
demonstrate power
Resilience.
crumbled.
It's the
Survival
newest
rates
version
climbed
of their
from 30 to
modular
nearly
RMB-50,
50%. What
shipped
once
in
seemed a graveyard
prefabricated
of seedlings
sections.
became
Đây là rạp chiếu phim này.
wide and stubborn
Rạp
across
chiếu
the
phim này, nhưng mà từ khi mình đến đây
Tragic.
brothers
School
and
books
sisters,
focused
let us
on
pause and
famine and
picture
war.
that day.
Hollywood
For
fed
decades,
them
Burkina
images
Faso
of
had
poverty.
harvested hunger,
It is a
reaped dust,
definition
gathered
of a century
disappointment.
turning,
But this
of a
time the
balance.
land bore
Massive
sweetness.
banners with a
Thousands of
hand-painted
tons of
portrait of
golden fruit
Traoré,
glistened under the
his
Sahel
military
sun.
And power
Fragrance of
over the
ripened
people he
pineapples
is
drifted
supposed
into
to
villages.
serve. Decisions that
Perfume
should
of
have
victory.
protected
Country
Promise
Kenya
fulfilled.
wants to be in
Families
2030,
loaded donkey carts,
in 2040.
motorbikes, even wheelbarrows
Right
with
now,
fruit, forming
Kenya-
caravans to markets.
Est-ce que
And for the
vous
first time in
envisagez
living memory, the poorest
effectivement
households could place
de
fresh fruit
respecter
on
These
their tables.
profound
No
questions.
longer was pineapple
Technology and
exotic
coordination
luxury
delivered
imported from
victory in
Cote d'Ivoire or
Fauteuil,
Ghana.
but
Now
by
it was the
rejecting
people's
UN
own
monitors,
harvest, grown
it
in
may
their
also
own
limit
soil,
access to
watered by
funds
their
that
own sweat,
international
defended
institutions
by their own
Status
hands.
has failed
Markets
spectacularly.
overflowed. The price
Not
of
just for
pineapples
me,
fell
but
not
for the
from
truth.
lack of demand,
Davis
but
and
from
Fred
sheer
Hampton.
abundance.
Traoré
Women's
was something they
cooperatives
hadn't
seized the
seen in
moment.
years.
They
A
dried
reflection
slices in
was
the
not
sun,
only possible,
packaging them in
but
small
essential.
bags stamped with the proud
By the
name
time the ink
Burkina
dried
Gold.
in St. Petersburg,
Youth groups
enough to
opened
keep
juice
56
stalls
reactors
blending
humming at
pineapples with
reduced load
hibiscus
for a
to create
limited
drinks that
time.
quenched both thirst
Meanwhile,
and
dependent on
imagination.
Moscow's gas,
Local
had
entrepreneurs
already
built
braced
small
for
processing
shocks.
units, pressing
France
juice,
had-
boiling
Paco
jam,
didn't just give them
fermenting
a
wine,
path to
and
the
soon
ocean.
state-backed
It gave them a
factories
path
rose in Ouagadougou
जो खास
and
तौर पर
Burkina
खरगोशों पर
Faso,
असरअंदाज
turning
हो
day and
क्योंकि
night.
खरगोशों को
Bottles of
गाजरें
juice,
बहुत पसंद
bags
थीं।
of dried fruit,
Fauteuil,
even the
the
first
20th
bottles
of
of
August,
Sahel pineapple wine rolled off
2025,
assembly lines.
dawn.
Jobs multiplied.
Commerce arrived
Farmers in the
discreetly,
fields,
meeting
packers
with
in the
Burkinabe
warehouses,
officials in
drivers on the
Koudougou.
roads,
Outside
marketers in the
Tao,
cities.
activated
An
Book
economy that
M2
once
mobile
begged for aid
surface
was
to
now
air missile
producing
batteries.
Kể cả cái mức dầu nó sẽ xấu hơn một chút nữa.
It
It was in the
belongs to the
protection of
people.
sovereignty.
As
When
international
multinational
human rights
corporations came
organizations,
Burkina
offering
Faso
billion-dollar
burns
contracts for
hottest.
exclusive
Officials
control,
ask,
he blocked
why
them.
is the UN quick
Instead,
to
he
count
formed
alleged
national
that they are now
cooperatives and
outnumbered,
export boards
not
managed
by
the people
violence,
themselves.
but by vision.
We will
That
export
Africa
fruit, he
was a
declared,
place of
but we
suffering,
will not
and that
export our
leadership
sovereignty.
required
And
compromise.
his words rang like
आसान
thunder
है
because they
मगर
spoke
इसे दोबारा
centuries of
जिंदा करना
African humiliation.
इंतहाई मुश्किल और अगर
From uranium in the Sahel to bauxite in Conakry,
This
the
time
continent-
Arrogance that blinds those who cannot see the rising tide of justice.
Raised
Satellite
alarm
images
bells.
revealed green
Reports
scars
of
across the
internet
desert
throttling.
frontier.
On ne souhaite
Belts
pas
of
que
pineapples
les gens
holding sand
commencent
in
des
place,
activités
slowing
politiques et qu'on
erosion,
soit amené à
creating
déployer des forces.
microclimates
Played under
where
fiery
onions,
sermons now
tomatoes, and
hesitated,
beans could grow
whispering
in
whether
shade.
the cause was cursed.
Beekeepers rejoiced
The
as
crack was not
pollinators.
just of a sovereign
Honey
African
production
future,
doubled.
or the outline of a
Livestock
new
grazed on
chain,
grasses
forged
sheltered
not
behind
build
pineapple
schools.
rows. Villages
Armor may
once
secure
buried by
highways,
dunes now
but
found
it cannot
themselves
plant
sheltered by
crops.
green walls. The
In
pineapples
return,
feed us,
Niger
said one
got
farmer,
what it
but
always
they also
got.
feed the land.
A few
And
jobs,
then came the cultural
City.
rebirth. Festivals
L'huile.
erupted to celebrate the harvest
Le
with
lait.
music, dance, and parades.
Can a
of
country
crowned
with limited
pineapples
resources
carried through
sustain the
streets like
maintenance and
holy
training
relics.
these systems?
Country.
Painters filled walls with
Makeshift
murals of
protest
fruit
art is
rising like
appearing.
shields.
Murals on
Poets
crumbling
declared,
wall.
"We
That
planted
perception
sweetness
mattered
where
as
there
much
was
as the
only
tactical
bitterness."
kill.
Children
Security,
recited verses
after
in
all,
classrooms, singing of
Faso is
crowns
building
that
something
drink
they
the sun.
can't own.
Pineapples appeared
A
on stamps,
grassroots
on
water
posters,
grid,
even
the
on
complaints.
banknotes. No
Fraud,
longer just a crop, they had
extortion,
become a symbol,
misrepresentation.
a badge of
Ce sont
defiance
des
of
individus
abundance, of
manipulés.
sovereignty. Internationally, the
Il n'y a
tone
pas de mal
shifted.
d'être une garnison.
Where once there had had been mockery, now
Le
there was
peuple a accepté le
fascination.
CCI.
News agencies
The
filmed
use versus
documentaries.
generational
Environmental
equity.
groups hailed the plan as one
Traoré's
of
vision
Africa's
goes further.
boldest
The true
climate
meaning of
resilience
his oath.
experiments.
So when we
Economists
reflect on
began
this
to ask,
moment,
could this new
let us
fruit rival the dominance of
Donc,
cotton?
il faut savoir
Could Burkina
communiquer
Faso
en temps
rise as a
de
new
guerre.
exporter on the world stage? Delegations
Your
came
country
again, this
might
time not
still
to
be
laugh,
buying
but to
hope
learn.
they already
Mali
own.
piloted small
Faith
pineapple
is not a
belts.
product.
Niger spoke of
đang
integrating
rất là sướng.
pineapples into its Great Green Wall. Senegal
Nãy bảo kết
considered
thúc
planting
video
on its
rồi nhưng
coastal
mà
front lines.
Overhead,
What had
a
begun as a
reconnaissance
gamble in
drone
one
relayed
nation was
real-time
now a
infrared
continental
footage.
conversation.
Vous croyez qu'on a combien
Yet
de
beloved,
soldats?
even in victory,
Quel était
questions
l'effectif de
remained.
l'armée? Bon,
The
avant
desert
que
was
l'on arrive.
slowed, not defeated.
Now we
Water
walk again.
remained scarce.
This is no
Infrastructure
longer
strained
a
to keep
youth
pace with
movement.
abundance.
This
And
is a
beyond
It is the
Africa,
land of
powerful
free
voices were
Africans.
unsettled.
Respect is
Pineapple
the only
exporters from
visa.
Costa Rica,
का
from
निशाना
the
बनाया
Philippines,
गया।
from
साइंसदानों ने
Cote d'Ivoire
एक
began
ऐसा
to whisper in
हयातियाती
European
हथियार तैयार
quarters.
किया
Carol Flores
Do not let
Moritzniak
the
is ordered
Sahel
out for a
flood our
child rights
markets.
report seen as blurring
Lobbyists
the
pushed
line
for
between
tariffs,
killers and
From the
regulations,
human
barriers.
chain outside
Yes,
the federal
harvest had
building,
come.
holding
Yes, the people
signs that
rejoiced.
read,
But the world is never content to let Africa
Les
rise without
batailles,
resistance.
il y a des morts.
If the first harvest
Mais
brought sweetness to the
53
people, the next
for
battle would
space on the
decide
ground.
this.
But one
Would
question now
Burkina
hangs
Faso's
over
crown
every
of
air
pineapples
corridor.
the
remain its
future
own?
of this movement
Or would
rests
the
on
world's
one
powers
question.
find a way to snatch
Can
it away?
admiration turn
Beloved,
into
when the fruits
application?
began
Down
to
the
ripen,
internet.
when markets
You can
overflowed
arrest
with sweetness,
organizers.
when murals
You
of
can block the
pineapples
road
crowned
to
the walls of
The Su-30
Ouagadougou,
drills code,
the world
named
could no
Iron
longer
Horizon,
ignore Burkina
were built
Faso.
around three
And how did
strategic
the world
pillars.
respond?
On est concentré
With a
sur la
divided
guerre, on ne
tongue.
peut pas encore se
In the West,
partager
there
pour
was unease.
sécuriser.
At first, they had mocked pineapples in the Sahara, they laughed.
Once dominated
But when
by
harvests
France and
filled
UN
warehouses
missions.
and exports
The
began to
expulsion of the
stir,
envoy then,
the
seen as
laughter turned to
isolationism.
nervous whispers.
It was
Aid
sovereignty,
agencies,
a
once dismissive,
recalibration.
now rushed to rebrand
Denis,
the
à quel
success as
niveau?
their own.
Comment,
They
quelle
sent
distance?
La direction du
delegations, they wrote
protocole est là.
reports, they stamped
Scathing.
glossy brochures
White
with
House
words like
spokesperson Elaine
innovation
Porter
and climate
called it a
resilience.
grave error
But
of
the
judgment.
Burkina Faso knew
In the
truth.
first place,
It had not been foreign
the king's
aid that brought
answer is
forth the
simple.
fruit. It had
True
been their
security
own hands,
begins.
That
their
night,
own sweat,
Traoré
their own
addressed the
leaders'
nation.
daring.
We
And
are
so
not
when
expelling a
outsiders tried to
building, he
claim credit,
declared.
the people
Door
answered,
on uranium exports.
"We planted with our
Why hasn't
hands,
France
not with our
crumbled
money.
overnight?
This wall belongs
Because
to us.
France had a
Across
backup
Africa,
over
the response was
strategy,
electric.
teamwork
Leaders from
over
Mali,
tokenism.
Niger, and Senegal toured the
Picture the
pineapple belts with
Africa-
astonishment.
Ou encore financièrement
Farmers in
apporter leur
villages hundreds
contribution.
of miles away
Beaucoup
whispered,
sont déjà rentrés.
if they can grow sweetness in sand,
Those
so
who
can
took
we.
the necessary
Traoré seized
steps,
the
no
moment,
matter how
calling for a regional
difficult to make it a
pineapple
reality.
corridor, a united
Quietly.
front of Sahel
It will
nations
sound like
exporting
chants in the
non-scarcity,
streets.
not suffering,
It will look
but sweetness
2025,
to the world.
6:45
The desert does
a.m.
not stop at our
The
borders,
dust
he
had barely
declared. So
in the
neither should our
Sahel.
wall of
The
sweetness.
AES is
His
becoming a
words
fortress
carried like a
outside
new
Western
anthem,
orbit.
inspiring visions
In
of a Sahel
barricaded.
that no
Not
longer
by
begged for
choice,
survival,
but by fear.
bargained as equals
Because
in
for the
global
first
trade.
time in years, the
And what
risk
of
is
America?
real.
Officially,
There's fear that
Washington was
government
quiet.
agents could
Yet in
provoke
New York,
violence.
in the
The
Bronx
sirens
and
howled
Brooklyn,
at 5:12.
in the diaspora communities
In
where
the semi-darkness of a
African-Americans
dust-
and West
Politics.
Africans mingle,
It happened because
news
they
of the
saw
pineapple
something in
wall
him that
stirred
they no
something
longer
deep.
saw in their
Markets
leaders.
began to carry dried fruit labeled
Excellence,
Sahel
on est
sweetness.
pratiquement
Jews from
au terme du
Ouagadougou
temps.
appeared
In
in
the
small
shadows
African
of global
shops.
development.
Elders who
It has
remembered
chosen a
famine now
dangerous
tasted the
path,
impossible.
but one
A
line
pineapple grown in
Chef
the
de
desert.
projet.
And with
En
every
tout cas,
bite, a
des
question grew
entrepreneurs.
louder.
build
If
out
Burkina
raises
Faso
another
can
question.
defy the desert,
Even with
what
the
else
best
is possible for
blueprints.
Africa?
Responsibilities of
But
law,
beloved, not
thought he
everyone
could strike
welcomed
at
this
me,
new power.
thought he could strip
In Europe,
my
lobbyists
dip.
from Costa Rica, the
Le reste,
Philippines, and
ça
Cote
viendra.
La
d'Ivoire
CEDEAO et la
pressed for
US.
tariffs to protect their pineapple
Ở đây người ta cũng đi vào buổi tối đây nhưng mà cũng không đông.
And so the question roars across the Sahel today, can a nation truly reclaim its dignity? Campaign funds? Some had signed contracts with churches under the guise.
They remind the public of the distance between the people and their leaders. That's what's at stake.
Lives are at stake.
The world was watching.
Of course,
But the greater
critics
question
argue that
remains.
Chinese influence comes
Could
with its
Burkina
own
Faso
risks.
defend its
No
crown on the
fallback
global
supplier
stage?
confirmed.
Or would the powers
Across
of
the
the world
Seine,
find a way to
trading
cut it down?
patrols and
By the fifth
checkpoints.
year, beloved, what had once
Sky
been a
threats
gamble was
were
no
someone
longer a
else's
whisper
problem
of doubt, but
until
a chorus
Nous
of
avons au moins
triumph.
ça,
Across
10
the
000 fois
frontier,
peut-être cette
belts of
quantité aujourd'hui.
pineapples stretched for hundreds of
No
kilometers.
signature. Just a
green
flash drive
crown laid
inside
upon the brow
labeled
of
Divine
Burkina Faso.
Access, knowing the state
desert
could
had
barely
not
equip or
vanished,
pay
no.
them.
It still breathed
Of course,
its hot breath.
the
It
government
still
does
sent
not
its
deny the
storms.
complexity.
But for the first
But
time
he
in living
failed
memory, the sand had been
spectacularly
sowed.
because
The
the
harvest now
facility.
numbered in the tens of millions each year.
On aura-
Trucks rolled
c'est-
from the
c'est sur
frontier
toute
to
la vie.
Ouagadougou
Gamble that could
and
spiral
Bobo
into
Dioulasso,
confrontation.
carrying
Either
mountains
way,
of fruit.
The
Local
sound of
markets
afterburners
overflowed.
by grouping Burkina
Families
Faso
ate
forces with
pineapples
insurgents.
daily, and juice
It reinforced the
factories hummed
perception
like
that the
choirs
UN
singing
was
praise.
blind to sacrifice.
Dried pineapple
One that
snacks
could
branded
finally
Sahel
break the
sweetness
isolation that
were
has
shipped to
stifled
Paris, to New
Sahelian
York,
growth
to
for
London.
generations.
और बच्चों के
Where
लिए खाने के
diaspora
लुक में
communities
कम पड़ने
tasted
लगे
not just
वो
fruit,
जमीन
but home,
जिसे कभी मकामी लोग
resilience,
अपनी
and
Was
victory.
symbolic.
Jobs multiplied.
When we see the
Women
armored
managed
vehicles,
nurseries, ran
an elder
drying
said,
houses,
Oh, isn't just
negotiated export
offensive, it's
contracts.
humiliating.
Youth who once dreamed
French
of crossing
companies
deserts
like
to Europe
Thanks
now found
for
livelihoods
watching.
in farming,
And stay tuned.
processing,
This
marketing.
journey is just
A generation
Thermoplastic
once told
polymer
their
shielding
land was barren.
and protected by national security law.
The desert had been
Its function?
transformed from a sentence of
Youngsters,
death into a
with
field of
smartphones held
possibility.
high.
But
Flags of Burkina Faso.
About the future of global resistance.
Ibrahim Traoré's true
Let's find
brilliance
out.
was not only in the planting, not only in the
Now,
harvest,
trust.
but in the guarding.
And once
For when
lost,
foreign
trust
corporations
is
came
hard
with
to
promises
rebuild.
of riches,
S'il y a
demanding
le cas, même
exclusive
on vous reçoit en même
contracts,
temps.
he
Vous exposez la
refused.
situation et
We
on
will export
vérifie.
fruit, he thunders,
Donc vous n'avez
but we will
aucun-
never export
Frustration
our
boiling
sovereignty.
under the surface.
Those words echoed
Young
far
Kenyans
beyond
have
Burkina
grown up
Faso,
watching leaders
across
prominent.
Africa,
EDF
where
triggered
too
a
many
level
nations
2
had
risk
lost
alert.
gold,
And
oil,
by
and
evening-
land to foreign hands.
Certaines
Ecologically, the belts
localités où il y
created
a pas de-
microclimates.
C'est
Shade
rare.
cooled the soil,
On va
bees pollinated
s'intéresser
blossoms,
également
livestock
à
grazed
celle
where once
au
there
sein
was
de la
only dust.
Ou bien vous
Some
remportez
called
la
it
bataille, vous
agriculture, but the
investissez
people
les
called it
lieux. Ça dépend où
healing.
vous investissez, vous
The
pouvez
desert
voir.
wanted
Reporters
to
call
bury
it
us, one
pragmatic
farmer said.
survival.
but we buried
Either
the
way,
sweetness.
the logic is simple:
Culturally, the
volumes
fruit
and linking
became a badge
any
of
deep
identity.
aquifer access to
Festivals of
long-term
harvest turned into
sustainability
national
offset
holidays.
clauses.
Musicians sang of the crowns of freedom. School children learned not only how to plant, but why to plant. To defend
Even
sovereignty,
politically,
to
the
feed their
ripple is
families,
spreading.
to build a nation
Candidates
that could
running
stand
for city
tall.
council and
The
local
pineapple was
Horizon
no
now
longer
tremble
just a
under
crop.
SR-5
It was
rockets.
destiny carved
On
in
the
the
ground, morale
yet,
appears
beloved, the
they
road ahead
thrived in
remains
safe
uncertain.
zones. Villages
The
and
desert is
camps
patient.
deliberately
Climate
set
is
up beyond the
unforgiving.
reach of outdated
Global
Côte
markets are
d'Ivoire
ruthless.
and funded through a
Enemies of
mix of
Africa's
African
rise still
Development
plot
Bank
behind
bonds
closed doors.
and its own
Will
terms.
tariffs strangle this new
The
trade?
shift is not
Will water
isolated.
shortages test the wall
Across
again?
the
Will the youth hold fast to the soil, or will temptation pull them away? The wall of sweetness stands, but the question remains.
of
Will it
risk.
endure as a legacy
Between
for
those two
generations?
portrayals lies
Will
the
the
rift
desert
that
bide
led
its
to the
time,
Ains an
waiting
open
for
battle.
one moment of
The
weakness to
27th
reclaim
of
the land?
August,
Brothers and sisters, we have
2025.
walked together through
Force
the
that
dust and
cannot
the
be
sweetness,
contained.
through the
Speak
storms and the
boldly.
harvest, through
Speak
the despair
boldly,
and the hope.
even when the
Chặt
We
như thế
have
này
seen
nhá.
how one command at dawn gave
Còn
birth to
người dân thường thì nó sẽ ở thành phố này thì có chỗ này là đẹp nhất thôi các bạn.
created by a foreign judge. He underestimated the power
This is a
of
story
truth.
that tells us, even in the harshest ground, even when the desert laughs at us, life
pourrait
can still push
développer à
through.
l'avenir pour le Burkina.
Ibrahim Traoré
Space
did
where
not just
schools
ask
now
his
rise
people
from
to plant
mansions,
pineapples.
where
He
prayer is
asked
no
them to
longer
plant
The
dignity.
integrity of your
He asked them to plant
institutions,
sovereignty.
the
He asked them to
dignity of
plant the
every
belief that
person
Africa
who
can
looks to
rise
Niger's
without
president
permission,
didn't ask.
without pity,
He declared.
without apology.
And in
And
that
so the 100
silence,
million pineapple plan became more than a gamble. It became
the
a testimony.
dignity,
It became a crown of
sovereignty, and
defiance
justice
lifted high
are
against the
not
winds of the
negotiable.
Sahara.
They
It
are
became a
In
song sung not in
Ouagadougou,
despair, but in
showing
celebration.
smiling nurses using
We
nuclear-powered
planted sweetness where
diagnostic
once there
machines.
was only bitterness.
not to those who buy
Beloved,
elections
let
with
us
it.
take this lesson into our
Burkina
own
Faso
lives.
did not
The
abolish
world tells you
religion.
your soil is barren to
legitimizing.
plant anyway.
It is a
When the
symbolic
critics laugh at
strike
your dream,
designed
water
to
it
make the
anyway.
world
When the
doubt
storm
your
buries your
influence.
hope,
Quietly.
dig it out with your own
It will
hands.
sound like
For
chants
even
in
if
the
1 in 10
streets.
survives, that
It will
one
look
is enough to
while
remind you that
overlooking
miracles
community
are still
resilience.
alive.
To
Now I turn
Burkina Bay
to you.
ears,
What do you see
अगर
in this
एक
story?
भी जोड़ा बच
Do you see a
जाता
nation
तो
planting
इनकी
fruit, or
नस्ल
do you see a
दोबारा
people
फैल सकती
planting
थी
their
is what
future?
France
Do you see the
just
struggle of
lost.
Burkina Faso?
This isn't just a
Or do you see
supply
the
shock.
reflection of your
It's a
own
credibility
journey?
share.
The
A
battles
young
you
engineer
faced,
or
the
farmer
deserts
is
you
listening,
crossed, the
and they
dreams
may
you
be the
dared
next
to
to
water.
tactician ask,
If this story
"Can
has
the
stirred
Sunday
something
sermon
in your
mention my
spirit,
name?"
I invite you.
The reply,
Leave a comment below,
For shock.
share your thoughts, and tell
Orano,
us.
once the quiet empire
What
builder
sweetness
of
are
the
you
Sahel,
planting in your own
Government
desert?
tried to label them
And do
as
not forget,
anarchists.
subscribe
But
to this
footage from the
channel, share
streets
this
shows
message
young
because
people-
delivery
together we are
receipts for
building
sound
not only an
systems and
audience,
custom
but a
robes,
community of
all
believers
expensed
in
by
possibility.
que
The desert may
nous
still
sommes
wait.
dans une
The
nouvelle
storms may still
configuration,
gather. But the
que des
crowns
gens
of
s'opposent
pineapple
à ce
rise
there is now a
proof.
precedent,
Proof that
a
even in the
model,
Sahel, even in
a
the
warning,
dust, sovereignty
and
can grow. And as Ibrahim
Đây các bạn trông thấy ở đây cũng đường phố rất là sạch.
Or
so
lectured,
too can we lift
Morocco
ourselves,
listened,
our
acted,
families,
and
our
delivered.
communities.
Watch more
Yes,
videos
beloved,
on
the
black
wall of
culture,
sweetness has been planted.
history,
Now the question is,
civilization.
will you
Sans
join
la
in
vie de soi,
planting
il ne
your
faut
own?
pas exposer